Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today we are going to cover a different topic. Now, we usually talk about Montessori, but the world of education does cover a lot of topics beyond what Maria Montessori wrote about. And one of the topics that I have been looking into lately is a new field of study called metabolic psychiatry. And the reason why I want to share this with you today is because it really has a new way of helping ourselves and our students through nutritional healing. And this is a path that I have been going down for the last couple of years. And I'm finding that the research is starting to get really incredible with this topic. So today we're going to start a series on metabolic psychiatry. We're going to follow along with a specific book, and I'm just going to make you aware of some of the things that are going on in this field of study, how it affects us personally, and how it may be beneficial for some of your students who are struggling with things like autism or ADHD. So this is the book that we are going to be looking at for the next few videos on this topic. And this is called Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, a powerful plan to improve mood, overcome anxiety, and protect memory for a lifetime of optimal mental health. And this is written by Dr. Georgia E. And if you are not familiar with her and you want to look more into her, you can go ahead and do a search on YouTube. And she's done a lot of interviews with a lot of doctors on YouTube. So you're able to dive into her work a little bit more on the internet if you just do a simple search. And also, if you want to get this book for yourself, I would highly recommend it. I am going to put my Amazon affiliate link for it down in the comment section below. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested. We are only going to go through the first two parts of this book, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. So before we begin, I just need to do a little disclaimer. This is not medical advice. I'm not a doctor or a health professional. Please consult your primary health practitioner or a doctor trained in a ketogenic diet before making any changes to your diet. Ketogenic diets are extremely powerful, and I know this because I am on one currently. And the more medications you are on, the more carefully you need to be watched by your doctor as you begin this journey. So I just want to put this note out here because there are a lot of different things that can change in your body very quickly when you try a diet like this. And if you're on medications, that's going to change quickly too. And so you really do need to have that supervision. I also want to share some of my favorite resources. I'll link to those down in the comment section below. Of course, I've already mentioned the book review on Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. That's what we're going to be following along with for this series. So that's going to be down in the comment section. And also, I have several YouTube channels that I personally love. And the two channels I listen to the most right now on metabolic health and research would be Dr. Eric Westman from Duke University and Dr. Nick Norwitz. He has a PhD from Oxford, and I believe he's currently at Harvard Medical School working on his MD. For a strict carnivore focus, I would recommend Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Shawn Baker, or Dr. Anthony Chaffee. They'll have clinical practice and successful YouTube channels on this subject. And also, I enjoy listening to Nutrition with Judy. She has a carnivore emphasis, but she also has this emphasis on mold and allergies. So those links will be down in the comment section below. And some of the tools that I personally use for my health, and my Amazon affiliate links will be available for these products down below. I use a Keto Mojo, and that tracks my glucose and keto monitor. So if you're interested in that, I'll link to that. I also use infrared therapy. I have an infrared sauna that I've been using, and I use Keto Chow electrolytes. So those are just some of my favorite tools that I personally use. So if you're looking into some of the things to get you started, those might be helpful. Now, the infrared therapy is not necessarily a ketogenic approach. It is simply something that a lot of ketogenic doctors also look into as a therapeutic. So before we jump into the book, I want to talk a little bit about my own story because I have a story of struggling with a lot of weight. And of course, when you're not feeling good about how you look and things are going wrong in your life, like many people, I've had periods of depression. And of course, dealing with all that as you're turning 40 as a woman is incredibly difficult. And so I found myself a few years ago, when I was approaching turning 40, I was incredibly overweight. I was having a lot of difficulty with a lot of things that just were not going well for me. And so I just was in this slump where I knew I had to change something about my life and I didn't know what. And actually 10 years before that, I was a raw vegan and I was working out a lot. I was doing hot yoga. I was doing all of that stuff. And some things happened in my life along the way, and I'm not going to get into that big whole story now. But for me, I took it out on food. And that's where I channeled my emotions. That's where I channeled everything. And before I knew it, I went from being a very healthy weight at 33 years old to approaching being 40 years old and getting up to about 250 pounds. And I felt miserable about myself. And when things go wrong in your life and you're already feeling bad about the way you're looking and the way you're feeling in your body, that just makes everything worse. So I knew that I had to change something about my life. And when I was going through YouTube one day, I started looking at some of these videos on health. And somehow I started getting these videos on the ketogenic diet and I started looking into it, but I didn't want to make any changes at first because I thought that this idea was absurd. The fact that you would eat this much fat just seemed absurd. And it seemed to go against everything I had ever learned about nutrition, and I really wasn't wanting to eat meat because I always thought that meat was part of the problem. So I was afraid of meat. I was afraid that, they were injecting hormones into all these meats. And that's why, I was struggling with hormones myself and I was struggling with my thyroid because of what they had done to the meat and the dairy products. And so I had a really hard time struggling with this idea of a ketogenic diet. It just seemed backwards. But I also knew that everything that I had tried had failed. And I knew I was in a really bad place. I was in a really unhealthy place. And this is not the way I wanted to approach being 40. I know that there's a lot of things that are about to change in my body even more so. And if I couldn't get it under control now, I didn't know what to do next. So I went out on a limb with this diet. And I thought one day, after studying a lot of videos, I said, you know what? I'm just going to do it. What do I have to lose? Right. And instead of just starting this diet, I almost felt like I needed to announce it because what I was doing was so different and weird and against the grain that I felt like I needed to let people know, this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm changing what I'm doing. And so in case I got any pushback, people could understand I'm just trying something new, right? And I also wanted my friends and family to hold me accountable. And actually, a friend who lives long distance had already done the ketogenic diet, and I didn't know that she had tried this diet. And so I actually found that I had somebody to talk to about it and to get advice from. And so I didn't feel so alone. So before I even started this diet, I just decided I was going to announce it, let people know, I'm changing things. I'm going to try and change this about myself and let's see what happens. Within the first few weeks, there were so many changes. In fact, at the end of the first week, I had already felt like I had lost a good 5 pounds. And as the months went by, I was losing probably a good 5, 10 pounds a month easily, maybe more than that. I was changing sizes in my clothes so quickly I couldn't keep up. And I loved it. That was really exciting. And from a diet perspective, that is an incredible feeling. That's a boost to your mood and your health right there, right? But I had also experienced this phenomenon a little bit with being a raw vegan. Just getting off the processed foods really does something incredible for your body. But there was something different about this ketogenic diet that I wasn't expecting that didn't happen with my raw vegan diet. And that was the dependence on ketones rather than glucose for energy. And that's really what we're going to focus on here. And so when I started learning more about this diet and learning about all the little details and all the intricacies about this diet, I wasn't prepared for how deep the healing could go. And we're going to talk about this scientifically. We're really going to focus on the science today. We're going to focus on what research is saying and what biology looks like and how this diet affects all those things. And so while it's good to say that I feel better on a certain diet, we also need to go and look at the science. And that's where I found myself discovering Dr. Georgia Ead's work and looking at this book and just being amazed at not only why I was feeling better and how to help myself do even better through this diet, but also, what's the potential for helping our students and for helping each other if we try something different? And I get the stigma around this diet is really difficult. And eventually I did switch all the way to a carnivore diet and I felt even better. That's not to say I didn't have some road bumps and some things to figure out, but that helped me even more. And you're going to see why that is as we go through this. So I'm hoping that you just keep an open mind, understand that I've been where you've been if you're really skeptical with this. So keep an open mind, see what the science is saying, see what's going on in research, and then see if it's something that you think could really help your personal life, your professional life, or just anybody that needs a little bit of encouragement and doing something differently. So that was my story. Let's switch over to talking about the book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. And this book is divided up into 4 parts. Now, we're only going to talk about the first 2 parts. And if you are really enjoying what we're doing here, I would encourage you to go out and get the book and get all 4 parts together. But let's just talk about those first 2 parts of the book because that really sets the framework as to why this is different. And the first part is Rethinking Brain Food. So we're going to talk about that today. That is our first part. And then our second part is going to talk about our descent into dietary madness and what's going on in the food industry. And if you are a MAHA person, if you're somebody who has been following RFK Jr., you're already going to be onto this, right? That there's a lot of stuff going on in the food industry that's very corrupt, and there's a lot of things going on here that have sold us this image of health that may not actually be scientifically true. And that's what we're going to go over in this series. Before we begin, I'm actually going to start at the end of this video series with some quotes from chapter 9. And the reason why we're going to do this is because I really think that that shows the path to where we're going. This is where we're going with this information. And so I want you to keep that in mind where our destination is so that when we're breaking everything down, you understand the point that we're coming to. So in chapter 9, she starts talking about the specific psychiatric conditions that they're using ketogenic diets for. And she says, at the time of this writing, there are clinical trials in the pipeline for anxiety, bipolar disorder, psychosis, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, college mental health, and Alzheimer's disease. The ketogenic diet is a powerful metabolic intervention that requires careful planning and medical monitoring. So if you are considering using this approach, please read chapter 18 carefully first to learn how to use this strategy safely. And she says the ketogenic diet rapidly reverses food and mood issues, and I can personally attest to that. So that's where we're going with this. We're looking at this as a therapeutic, something that we can do in combination with medications or replacing medications with a diet in some instances. Let's talk quickly about autism because that's something on everybody's mind, right? If you're teaching and you're seeing a lot more autism in your classroom, let's look at that for a second and see what the ketogenic diet offers for children with autism. And on page 153, she talks about research results from a 6-month randomized controlled test in Egypt. She said, behavior symptoms improved most in the gluten-free, casein-free group, whereas social, speech, and cognitive symptoms improved most on a ketogenic diet. So there's already some randomized controlled tests going on, and we already know that a lot of gluten-free diets can help children with autism, but a ketogenic diet also has benefits, and they may be a little bit different. So we're looking into that right now. And we're going to go over the different types of testing and break down what types of scientific testing is most reliable, and that'll be something that we quickly go over in this first part. She also says on page 153, a common problem seen in autism is that mitochondria are less efficient at turning glucose into energy, partly because of specific defect in complex 1, the main gateway to the electron transport chain. Ketogenic diets partially bypass that defective area by feeding more fuel molecules directly into complex 2, allowing damaged mitochondria to generate efficiently again. Ketogenic diets also improve the health of existing mitochondria and stimulate the production of new mitochondria. So if you are looking into the ketogenic diet, this is something that you are actually going to come back to time and time again, this idea of damaged mitochondria and the idea of burning ketones instead of glucose for energy. So those are 2 important concepts that we're going to get into in this series. And then on page 160, she talks about going beyond ketosis. And she says ketogenic diets support and stabilize brain metabolism with ketones, allowing the brain to operate more cleanly, smoothly, and efficiently. But optimal mental health is about more than just ketones. The nutritional quality of your diet matters too. If it's optimal brain health you seek, you'll need to do more than just energize your brain. You'll need to nourish and protect it as well, and this is where food choices come into play. So that's what we're going to look at when it comes to the series. That's our goal. How is the food that we are currently eating affecting our brain health? What's going on with the mitochondria? What's going on with the way that we are burning energy? Is it more efficient for us to burn ketones instead of glucose? So that's something I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. So that brings us to the first part of the book. These are the first 5 chapters. And if you think it's going to be really crazy to try and fit 5 chapters into this first part, what I'm going to tell you right now is that I'm really, really narrowing down the information in those first 5 chapters just to give you a taste of what's in there. That way you can decide whether or not this book is worth purchasing for your own benefit, or if you have enough information that you can move forward with some decisions about this diet. So in this first part, she's talking about rethinking brain food. What is good for our brain? So let's dig into that. So chapter 1 is just a basic introduction, and we're not going to cover too much from chapter 1. We're just going to dip into the subject. So in chapter 1, she asks 3 questions for us to consider, and she says, could some psychiatric illnesses be partly, largely, or even entirely dietary in origin? What is it about the standard American diet that may be contributing to poor mental health? And she asks, how many people might be able to reduce, avoid, or eliminate the need for psychiatric medications using dietary strategies? And if you're somebody who's into nutritional healing, this idea is completely up your alley. So keep an open mind and let's see where this goes. So on page 5, she talks about rethinking brain food. And she says, I was genuinely shocked to learn that there is absolutely no science or logic behind recommendations to eat plant-based diets, balanced diets, high fiber diets, low cholesterol diets, or diets containing whole grains, low-fat dairy products, or rainbows of fruits and vegetables. The truth about nutrition is this: meat is not dangerous, vegan diets are not healthier, and antioxidants are not the answer. So, where can we look for answers? And that brings us to chapter 2. So that was pretty easy to get through. In chapter 2, she talks about the new science of hope. On page 24, she brings up the topic of metabolic dysfunction. And she says this new subspecialty was coined by Stanford University psychiatrist Dr. Shawn Baker, who defines it as a new subspecialty focused on targeting and treating metabolic dysfunction to improve mental health outcomes. Investigations in this field are discovering that what many psychiatric conditions have in common is that the brain has trouble burning glucose for energy. One of the most important obstacles to brain energy flow is insulin resistance. The more sugar your diet contains, the harder it becomes for your brain to use it. Repeatedly flooding the brain with too much glucose triggers unrelenting waves of inflammation and oxidative stress, damaging your brain's delicate architecture and overwhelming the mitochondria, tiny engines inside your cells that work tirelessly to turn glucose into energy. So we're just diving into this idea of how the brain is made, how the brain functions, and also what sugar is actually doing to the brain when we eat it. And so this may be something for you to consider when you're looking at students in your classroom who are having meltdowns maybe after lunch or after they've had a lot of sugar. So this is something to think about. On page 25, she says the keto diet is powerful. It's powerful metabolic medicine. And she says reimagining mental health disorders as metabolic disorders has opened the door to exciting new treatment approaches, the most powerful of which is the ketogenic diet. And then she talks a little bit about the origin of the ketogenic diet. And if you thought it was this new thing, it's actually not. It was originated in 1921. And she said the ketogenic diet was invented to treat children with epilepsy, cutting seizure activity by more than half in more than 50% of cases, and completely eliminating seizures in 10% or more. And she says psychiatric conditions are neurological conditions. It's just that their symptoms were historically considered to be more psychological than biological. So when we take a look at the brain and we see how the brain is functioning, changing your diet, changing that fuel source can drastically change how the brain operates. And we have seen this with people who struggle with epilepsy. On page 26, she talks about the connections between epilepsy and mental health. And I think you'll find this very interesting. She says bipolar disorder and epilepsy share many common underlying features. In fact, many of the medications we prescribe to treat bipolar disorder are anti-seizure medications. And this is where she starts asking, what does a brain healthy diet need to accomplish? So let's look into defining a brain healthy diet. On page 26, she says there are 3 things that you need to think about with a brain healthy diet. She says 1, nourish the brain with essential nutrients. 2, protect the brain by excluding damaging ingredients. And 3, energize the brain in ways that support healthy metabolism. She says ketogenic diets reliably lower glucose and insulin levels. So they are very effective at addressing insulin resistance, and they excel at energizing the brain because they generate ketones that the brain can use as a supplemental fuel source. But their ability to nourish and protect the brain can vary tremendously depending on food choices. And that brings us to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is really going to challenge you because she talks about why most nutritional guidelines are wrong. And this is where I had fallen down the rabbit hole years ago with what I thought was healthy. And now we're going to take a deeper look into what the science actually is that's regulating these guidelines and whether or not that is trustworthy. So on page 31, she talks about modern nutritional research methods. She says epidemiologists study brain food from the outside in by questioning large populations about their dietary habits and looking for patterns. A more logical strategy is to study brain food from the inside out by asking what the human brain needs to develop and function properly, and which foods are best at meeting those needs. And so she's going to talk about this idea of the pyramid of research methods on page 31. And she really goes into a deep dive on these methods. And we're not going to cover this in this video. That's not what this video is for. It's simply to give you a taste of what this method is and how it works. But I do want to show you that pyramid of research methods. So let's take a look at this. At the very bottom of this triangle, you see case series and case reports. These are, I guess you could say, maybe the least scientific of all these methods, but they are important. I don't want to dismiss their importance because everything in research has to start with a case series or a case report. Something needs to be happening and something needs to get reported to get people's attention. So that's the bottom, right? We want to build on that. And then up from that is the epidemiological and observational studies. So as you can see, if a lot of the guidelines that we're using in nutrition and health are based on these epidemiological studies, that's at the bottom of the triangle, which means that they don't have as much reliability. There isn't as much control. You're going to see throughout this book that she explains why we need to do a lot more before we make conclusions about our health than just relying on epidemiological studies. And I can tell you from going down that rabbit hole on YouTube and listening to different doctors, they will consider maybe a value meal at a fast food chain like McDonald's. Let's say you get hamburger and bun with French fries and a milkshake. They'll consider that a carnivore meal because it has meat in it. They completely dismiss the fact that there is probably, couple 100 grams of carbs in what you're eating, but they classify that as meat. It's meat. You're eating meat because there is one thing of meat in it and dismiss the rest of the sugar that's involved in that meal. And so that's what happens sometimes with these observational studies and these epidemiological studies. They categorize foods sometimes in a way that really pushes bias. And so then they can say, oh, because these people ate meat, their cholesterol went crazy. Well, did you look at how much sugar they were eating in comparison to the meat? And that's how these epidemiological studies can really be manipulated to cover a certain bias. Now, one up from the epidemiological studies are the non-randomized control trials. And then there are the randomized control trials above that. And if you remember, when we were talking about autism, they were doing those RCTs in Egypt studying autism. So that's a pretty good study. It's almost to the top of this pyramid. And then at the very top, they're going to talk about meta-analysis of RCTs. Now, if you follow somebody like Dr. Nick Norwitz, who I recommended on my resources page and I'll link to down below, He is very big in talking about research, and he'll talk about these randomized control trials, and he'll talk about meta-analysis. So you have a lot of great YouTubers out there who are really breaking down the science. They're looking into the science, and they're not just looking into the science, but the quality of the science used. And that's what I like about some of the people that I've been following, is that they're not using science that's easily manipulated. And they're also very honest about the limitations of each study, and they'll be very forward with what each study has to offer and its limitations. That brings us to chapter 4, a guided tour through your brain. Now, this gets really deep into the brain and all the medical jargon that goes along with it, and I'm not going to spend too much time. I don't want to dive too deep into that. I want to give you a basic overview, let you know what's in the chapter, and then move on, because what I really want to get to is showing you how this can affect your life or possibly help a student that maybe is struggling in your classroom. So let's take a look what she says about the brain in chapter 4. So she takes this really deep dive into the different parts of the brain, and she talks about neurotransmitters on page 55. We're not going to go into that, but I am going to show you the chart in just a moment. She also talks about protein and how that affects the brain, and she has a chart on page 61, which I'm not going to show you today, but she does list all those amino acids in this chapter. And then she goes on to talk about fatty acids and how that affects the brain, as well as cholesterol and carbohydrates. So if you want a detailed description about each of those components and how they affect your mental state, cognition, and the functioning of the brain, that's what this chapter is all about. For right now, let's just look at that neurotransmitters chart so that you get an idea of the quality and type of information she includes. So as you can see, she has listed all those neurotransmitters on the left-hand side. She talks about the role in the brain, and then she gives examples of medications that are used for that particular neurotransmitter. And so you can see that there are all of these neurotransmitters. They have a lot of different roles in the brain, and there's a lot of medications to go with it. But if we can replace some of those medications with a dietary change, that would be more beneficial, and she goes into talking about that in this book. So that was chapter 4. That's just a small overview. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time going into the depth of everything. I want to get to the main points. So let's go into chapter 5, talking about the magic of brain metabolism. Here are the key points from chapter 5. On page 79, she talks about how glucose and ketones burn differently. And we've gone over that a little bit, right? When your brain depends on glucose, on sugar, to run for a source of fuel, sometimes that's not efficient for some people, and some people do better burning ketones. Ketones burn more quickly and easily. As complicated as the science of brain metabolism may appear, it reveals some simple truths about macronutrients, micronutrients, and meal timing that must be respected if we are to achieve optimal mental health. And she says the brain requires all essential micronutrients. The brain is a hybrid engine that requires some glucose at all times, but that glucose does not need to come from dietary carbohydrate. And just to break that down a little bit, there is a process called gluconeogenesis, and if you eat extra protein, that process of gluconeogenesis converts protein into glucose. So if you're not eating sugar, it's not that you are removing all glucose from your body. Your body does need glucose. Your brain needs glucose. So you can't cut it out of your body, of your system. But there is a process in which your body converts protein into glucose. So not only do we have this idea of ketones versus glucose, we have this process of gluconeogenesis. She also says on page 83 that the brain can't use glucose properly without adequate insulin. And she says the brain needs to spend some time in ketosis on a regular basis. For anyone who is type 1 or type 2 diabetic, you are very afraid of ketoacidosis. That is different than ketosis. Ketosis is when you are burning ketones for fuel. And that's not dangerous. In fact, that happens usually during the night while you're sleeping. Every day we fast during the night, correct? You stop eating, you go to bed, you don't eat for a long time, and then you get up and eat breakfast. That's how most of us spend the dinner to breakfast hours, resting or sleeping, not eating. And so during that time, your ketones are naturally going to rise. And the more you eat, the more food that you eat with glucose in it during that fasting phase, the less you're able to get into ketosis. And so ketosis has always been this therapeutic benefit of sleeping, of stopping eating for this time every day. And so this is not dangerous, but ketoacidosis is dangerous. And so there is a difference between those two things. And you can be in different levels of ketosis. You can be in a very minor level of ketosis, a moderate level of ketosis, and then you can get into this therapeutic level of ketosis. And those are mainly the levels you want to get to if you're dealing with a major issue, maybe like cancer. The rest of us are fine in more of a minor to moderate level of ketosis. And if you have more questions on that, just let me know, because I do have a ketone monitor. I do check my ketones, and this is something that I do on a daily basis. So let me know if you have any questions about that below. So that is where we're going to end with chapter 5. This is simply the first part in a 3-part series that I'm doing on this book and on this subject. So today we're just diving into the beginning. We're just getting a taste of it. I'm telling you, what the results can be, what the benefits are, and what she is saying about the brain and how it functions differently with a diet that's based on ketones instead of glucose. Now, when you are producing ketones, that means that you're using fat for your source of energy instead of sugar. So for me, when I want to get into a high level of ketosis, I bring down my intake of protein and carbs, and I up my fats, and I will literally eat things like butter, cocoa butter, things that have 0 carbs, 0 protein, but high fat. I will have a ribeye steak with butter on top of it to add more fat on. When I try to get into this deeper level of ketosis to help heal my body, I am eating a lot of fat, and that just seems a little scary if you're not used to that. And also it can be difficult on your digestive system if you're not used to it. So that's why there's a lot of things about the ketogenic diet that can be difficult, that need to be monitored by doctors. And I do go to a ketogenic doctor. And so I do have a doctor who's trained in this method that understands it. But one of the benefits, if you're asking me, why are you doing this? Why are you trying to get into this deeper level of ketosis? And one of the things you'll hear if you decide to listen to more videos on this topic is that there's a lot more healing that goes on in ketosis, and it can heal damaged mitochondria. So not only are you bringing down inflammation, you're bringing down inflammation in your brain, in your body. There are a lot of people with IBS, rheumatoid arthritis, and other conditions with high inflammation. And as somebody who deals with an autoimmune issue, I also have inflammation, and being into a higher level of ketosis for me brings that inflammation down. And that's some of the benefits for that. And I just want to explain that. I know this kind of went by really quickly. We covered a lot, but it went by quickly, and I probably have left you with some questions. So if you do have questions, please leave them down below, comment down below. I will do my best to answer them or point you in the direction of a ketogenic doctor that has more information than what I can explain. And also, one thing I didn't mention is that it also has really helped my dad. He's in his 70s. He's been a diabetic, I don't know, maybe about 30 years. He's been on insulin shots for about 15 years, and they always said he would never be able to be off his medication. Well, he is in his 70s, and within, I think, 6 to 7 months of being on a ketogenic diet, just getting his carbs down to 30 carbs or less a day, he went off all of his medications for the most part within 6 to 7 months. And that includes the blood pressure medication, which is something you need to be aware of. If you start a ketogenic diet and you're on blood pressure medications, that is something that's going to change drastically, because a carb-heavy diet holds on to sodium. And when you're on a ketogenic diet and you're not having those carbs to keep your sodium levels within your system, they're going to flush right through. And so starting this diet, you're actually going to need to be on a lot more salt and electrolytes. Otherwise, you're going to get dizzy pretty quickly. And so the first few months of this diet, I had to be literally licking salt off a teaspoon every day to keep myself from feeling dizzy. And so until you normalize, that's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit scary. And that's why I say it's important that you are under a doctor's supervision, that you understand what you're getting into with this diet, and you also understand how quickly your body can change. So that's all I have for this first part. Again, we're only going to be reviewing and looking at the first 2 parts of this book. So the next 2 videos that I'm going to make are based on part 2. our descent into dietary madness, and we'll get more into the details. We won't go so quickly through the chapters in the next part. I will spend a little more time breaking down all that information in the next 4 chapters that we cover. So that's all I have for you today. If you like what I'm doing here, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, like, share, comment, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.